On July 10, 2026, Princess Leonor stood on a runway at the General Air and Space Academy in San Javier, Murcia, and received the Grand Cross of Aeronautical Merit. She was the first person in Spanish history to complete officer training in all three branches of the armed forces. 3 years of her life had gone into that moment: Zaragoza, the Atlantic crossing on the Juan Sebastián de Elcano, the cockpit of a fighter trainer over the Mediterranean. And within days, a completely different version of Leonor was circulating online. Not the officer, not the future head of state. A bride, engaged, according to some corners of the internet, to a man most of her own country had never heard of. Set to break, according to the title of more than one video, an unbreakable royal rule. So let's deal with that claim honestly, right at the start, because that's the only way to deal with it. There is no engagement. There is no confirmed boyfriend. The Spanish royal household has made no announcement of any kind about Leonor's romantic life, and as of this recording, nothing in the reliable record, not Spanish state media, not the royal household's own channels, not a single verified statement from anyone close to the family, supports the idea that Princess Leonor is getting married, has a fiancé, or is in a relationship that's been publicly confirmed. What you'll find instead, if you go looking, is a rotating cast of names. A retired footballer she was photographed near once. A man nobody can identify with a surname that changes depending on which video you're watching. Engagement rumors that have been confirmed by YouTube thumbnails for months without a single fact behind them. That's not journalism. That's not even rumor, really. It's just noise generated because a 20-year-old future queen is interesting, and noise gets clicks whether or not it's true. Here's the thing though, buried underneath that noise is a real story, and it's more interesting than any of the fake ones, because it's true. Spain's constitution actually does contain a marriage rule that could, one day, cost Leonor her crown. It's real, it's specific, it's never been tested, and almost nobody explains it correctly. That's what this video is actually about, not a wedding that isn't happening, but a constitutional trapdoor that's been sitting under the Spanish monarchy since 1978, waiting for a moment nobody can predict. Let's start with what the law actually says, because this is where most coverage falls apart. Article 57 of the 1978 Constitution is the article everyone already half knows. It's the one that lays out the order of succession, the one that made Leonor heir over her younger sister Sofia only because there was no brother born after her. But tucked inside that same article, in its fourth paragraph, is a separate and much stranger provision. Article 57.4 gives the King and the Cortes Generales, Spain's parliament, the joint power to expressly prohibit a marriage involving anyone with succession rights. And if that person marries anyway, against that express prohibition, the consequence isn't a fine or a scandal. It's automatic exclusion. That person, and their descendants, are simply removed from the line of succession to the throne. Not politically pressured out. Constitutionally erased from the list. Think about what that means for a moment. This isn't a tradition. It isn't a norm that gets enforced by public pressure or tabloid shame the way it might in the UK. It's a hard constitutional mechanism, written into the same document that gives the monarchy its entire legal existence. If Leonor were ever to marry someone the King and the Cortes formally and jointly decided to prohibit, the Constitution itself would strip her, and any children she had, of the right to ever become monarch of Spain. And here's what makes it stranger still: the Constitution never says what would actually justify that prohibition. There's no checklist, no list of disqualifying nationalities, professions, religions, or criminal histories. The original drafters in 1978 were writing in the shadow of a much older European tradition, where royal marriages were vetted for religious compatibility. Specifically, marrying a non-Catholic was historically treated as the disqualifying factor across several European monarchies, Spain included. But the actual text of Article 57.4 doesn't say religion. It doesn't say anything. It just hands the King and Parliament the power to say no, for whatever reason they choose to give, whenever the moment arrives. That ambiguity isn't a drafting mistake. Constitutional scholars have pointed out for years that it was almost certainly intentional, a pressure valve deliberately left vague so that whatever situation eventually arose, the government of the day would have room to maneuver rather than being boxed in by an overly specific 1978 definition of what makes a marriage acceptable. Now, if this sounds abstract, it's worth knowing that this exact family has lived through something like it before, just not under this constitution. Go back to 1933, to Leonor's great-great-grandfather's household. King Alfonso XIII had two sons ahead of Juan Carlos's father in the line of succession, Alfonso, Prince of Asturias, and Infante Jaime. Both were removed from the succession within the same year. Jaime's exclusion came after health issues that were deemed disqualifying for physical rule under the standards of the time. Alfonso's came because he chose to marry a Cuban commoner, Edelmira Sampedro, against his family's wishes, in a marriage that had no political sanction behind it. He renounced his rights. The throne eventually passed down a different branch of the family entirely, to Juan, and then generations later to Juan Carlos, and then to Felipe, and now, presumptively, to Leonor. The Spanish crown has, quite literally, already changed hands once in the 20th century over exactly the kind of marriage dispute that Article 57.4 was written to formalize into law. It's not ancient history invoked for atmosphere. It's the direct institutional memory the 1978 drafters were writing with in the room. It's also worth saying plainly that Spain isn't unique in wrestling with this. Royal houses across Europe have spent the last century slowly walking back exactly this kind of marriage control, because it kept colliding with modern ideas about personal freedom and gender equality. The UK didn't fully modernize its version until the succession to the Crown Act of 2013, which removed the centuries-old rule disqualifying anyone who married a Roman Catholic, a rule that had been sitting on the books since the Act of Settlement in 1701. Other European monarchies still require a monarch's formal consent for a family member to marry without losing their place in the succession. It's a live legal mechanism in more than one country right now, not just a Spanish quirk. Spain's version is unusual mainly in how much discretion it hands to a sitting government, rather than restricting the rule to a fixed, predictable category like religion. That discretion is exactly why it's never been tested. Nobody in the line of succession close enough to matter has married since 1978 in a way that came anywhere near triggering it. Which is worth sitting with for a second, because it changes how urgent this story actually is. Leonor is 20 years old. She graduated from military training in July. She's enrolling this September in a political science degree at Carlos III University in Madrid, and by every available account her calendar for the next several years is built around finishing that degree and continuing her formal preparation to eventually become queen, not around a wedding. The people manufacturing engagement videos aren't reporting a marriage. They're inventing a countdown clock that doesn't exist, because she's getting married performs better than she's 20 and in university, even though only one of those is true. If you've been with this channel for a while, you already know why that distinction matters to us. This channel exists because the space around European royal coverage is genuinely flooded right now, with AI-narrated stock footage channels stitching together stock photos and confident-sounding fabrications, with thumbnails promising engagements and secrets that don't hold up to 5 minutes of checking. We're not interested in competing with that by being louder. We're interested in being the channel that tells you when something is real, tells you when it isn't, and still finds you the story underneath, because there usually is one, and it's usually better than the fake version. If that's the kind of channel you want in your subscriptions, now's a good moment to hit that button, because we're about to go somewhere the boyfriend rumor channels can't follow us, into what actually happens if Article 57.4 is ever triggered for real. So let's walk through the mechanics. Say, hypothetically, years from now, Leonor decides to marry someone. Under Article 57.4, the king, at that point, presumably still Felipe VI, or whoever the reigning monarch is, and the Cortes Generales would have to act jointly to issue a formal, express prohibition before the marriage for the exclusion to apply. This isn't something that happens by default or by public disapproval. Silence isn't a prohibition. Uncomfortable questions in Parliament aren't a prohibition. It requires an actual, deliberate, joint political act, the monarch and both houses of Parliament formally saying no to a specific marriage before it happens. If that formal step is taken and Leonor married the person anyway, she and any children from that marriage would be constitutionally removed from the succession. The crown would then pass to whoever is next in line. At the moment, that would be her younger sister, Infanta Sofia. But if no such formal prohibition is ever issued, if the king and the Cortes simply decline to act, whether out of political caution, public support for the match, or simple reluctance to wade into someone's personal life, then there's no mechanism at all. Leonor could marry anyone, and nothing in the Constitution would touch her succession rights. The rule isn't a general morality clause hovering over the monarchy. It's an opt-in veto that has to be actively exercised by two separate branches of government working together, and Spain's fractured, coalition-heavy parliament of the last 2 decades gives you a sense of just how hard that kind of joint action actually is to pull off, even when everyone agrees on far less controversial things. That last point connects to something else worth understanding about this constitution, because it explains why Article 57.4 has survived untouched since 1978 even as other parts of the succession rules have drawn serious criticism. Reforming any part of Article 57, including the male preference succession clause that made Leonor heir only because no brother was born after her, requires clearing one of the highest bars in Spanish constitutional law. It needs 2/3 approval in both houses of parliament, then the dissolution of that parliament, then 2/3 approval again from the newly elected chambers, and finally a national referendum. Multiple Spanish governments since the mid-2000s have said, in public, that they support modernizing the succession rules. None of them have actually started that process, because a referendum that touches the monarchy's founding rules risks becoming a referendum on the monarchy itself. And pulling out of the University of Murcia and other Spanish research groups over the past several years has consistently shown meaningful, if minority, Republican sentiment in the country, enough that no government wants to be the one that hands the public a live vote on the crown's basic legitimacy. So the entire structure of Article 57, the gender rule, the marriage veto, all of it, sits frozen, not because anyone thinks it's perfect, but because touching it is politically more dangerous than leaving it alone. That's the actual story here, and it's a genuinely uncomfortable one if you think about it for more than a few seconds. Leonor's entire adult life, the military academies, the fluency in 8 languages, the constitutional oath she swore in front of the Cortes on her 18th birthday, has been, in part, a strategy for keeping an unresolved, decades-old argument about gender and monarchy from ever having to be settled in court or at the ballot box. She spent 3 years demonstrating competence precisely because competence is the one thing that makes an outdated rule feel less urgent to fix. And sitting quietly next to that gender question is this second, less discussed one, a marriage clause with almost no defined boundaries, waiting for a future government to decide, on the fly, what does and doesn't count as an acceptable match for a queen. Nobody knows what would trigger it. Not because it's classified, because it has genuinely never been tested since the Constitution was written, and the people who wrote it left the door open on purpose. It's also worth remembering how recently this family's relationship with public trust has been tested by an entirely different kind of crisis, because it shapes how carefully the current generation manages its image. Leonor's grandfather, Juan Carlos I, left Spain for self-imposed exile in August 2020 following a string of financial allegations that badly damaged the monarchy's standing at exactly the moment his son Felipe was trying to stabilize it. That's not ancient history to this family. It's recent enough that Felipe and Letizia have visibly built Leonor's entire public rollout, the military service, the constitutional oath, the disciplined, scandal-free public presence, as a kind of long, deliberate rebuilding project. Which is exactly why a manufactured engagement scandal, even a fake one, isn't just annoying to the royal household. It's a direct threat to the one thing this generation of the family has worked hardest to protect, the sense that Leonor is boring, in the best possible sense, that she's serious, competent, and entirely unlike the version of royal life that got her grandfather run out of the country. So where does that leave the actual answer to the question this video's title asks? Will Leonor's marriage break royal rules? Right now, there's no marriage to break anything. What's real is that when she does eventually marry, years from now, on whatever timeline is actually hers to choose, she will do it under a constitutional clause with almost no defined limits, enforced by a king in a parliament that would have to actively agree to invoke it, sitting inside a legal document so difficult to amend that even its most criticized provisions have survived nearly 50 years untouched. That's not a scandal. It's a structural fact about the monarchy Leonor is being trained, right now, to inherit. And it's a far stranger, far more consequential story than any invented boyfriend could ever be. If this is the kind of story you came here for, the real mechanics behind the headlines, not the manufactured version, there's a lot more of that queued up on this channel, including a full breakdown of exactly what Leonor's new life looks like this September as she starts at Carlos III University, the first time in her adult life she'll be a full-time student rather than a full-time cadet. That's next. Subscribe if you want to be there for it, and I'll see you in the next one.